welcome to The Pause. Today's deep dive into a very brief piece of writing called The Architect of the Learned Self asks one quiet but fundamentally unsettling question. What if your personality isn't really you?
It really is intellectual whiplash right from the start.
Yeah, it is. And before we get into it, I just want to set the mission for today. We are going to slow down. We're not here to throw around psychological jargon or land on rigid, firm conclusions. We just want to have a curious, exploratory conversation with you, the listener.
Right, because we operate almost entirely on this assumption that our personality is the bedrock of our identity. It's the absolute given of our existence, We spend decades curating it, defending it. But this text strips away that comforting scaffolding immediately. The very first line is, you think your personality is you.
Which is such a wild starting point. It presents this not as a universal truth, but as an assumption we've just blindly accepted.
Exactly, and it doesn't leave that claim hanging. It gently guides us to reflect on what we actually mean when we say personality. The author boils it down to three specific things: your preferences, your reactions, and your habits.
I have to admit, reading that for the first time, it felt almost a little reductive. I mean, is the text seriously suggesting that the entirety of human identity is just a collection of behavioral loops?
It's a really stark way to frame the human experience, but if we analyze those three pillars without romanticizing them, the argument holds a ton of weight. Think about preferences first. The things you naturally gravitate toward, or the things you dislike.
Like saying, I am a coffee person.
Yes, or the art we resonate with, our moral intuitions. We tend to view our tastes as deep, soulful expressions of our inner being. We don't just prefer certain things, we use them as shorthand for our entire identity.
Right, we calcify a preference into an I am statement. Someone doesn't just say they prefer a quiet evening. They label themselves an introvert. They treat it as this immutable law of their nature.
But a preference is really just a heuristic. It's a mental shortcut.
So we don't have to expend cognitive energy deciding who we are every single time we walk into a new room.
Precisely. And the text pushes this even further with the second component, which is your reactions. This one is fascinating to unpack because reactions are fundamentally biological. They bypass our conscious reasoning entirely.
Like your knee-jerk emotional responses to the world.
Right. When your heart rate spikes in a crowded room, or you instantly withdraw when there's conflict, that's an autonomic nervous system response. It's a survival mechanism, but we rarely contextualize it that way.
We take a transient physiological response to something external and we
staple it to our identity.
Yes. We say, I am an anxious person,
Mm-hmm.
rather than my nervous system is currently executing an anxious response. We completely blur the line between the machinery of our biology and the essence of who we are.
And that blurring gets reinforced heavily by the third thing mentioned in the text: your habits. The invisible routines that make up your day. Habits are literally just the rewiring of the brain based on repeated action.
The grooves worn into the record over time.
Yeah, exactly. But because we execute them daily, from the way we structure our mornings to our default communication styles, they provide this persistent illusion of a fixed character.
So if we play along with the text for a second, I want you, the listener, to try this thought experiment right now. If you temporarily suspend your deeply held preferences, and if you silence your immediate physical reactions and remove the behavioral grooves of your daily habits, what exactly is left behind?
It creates this profound, echoing emptiness, a kind of philosophical void.
And humans really despise voids.
We do. We crave solidity. Which brings us to the next pivotal line in the source material. It says, but personality is shaped slowly. That word slowly is the key to understanding why the illusion of a permanent self is so incredibly convincing.
Because personality doesn't change overnight. It tricks us into thinking it's permanent.
Exactly. The lack of sudden disruption is what fools us. We don't feel ourselves changing day to day, so we assume we have always been this way.
It's the classic boiling frog scenario, but applied to human identity. Because you don't wake up on a Tuesday with an entirely new set of moral frameworks and emotional triggers. You just assume you're a finished product.
The continuity of our physical body and our memories makes us believe in the continuity of our character. If you drastically changed overnight, you'd probably think you were having a medical emergency.
Right, but because the weathering of your identity happens in microscopic increments, like a slight shift in a belief here or hardening an emotional boundary there, you just claim it as growth.
Or you tell yourself, well, this is just who I've always been. Identity isn't a fixed sculpture. It's a highly malleable material being continuously subjected to external pressure.
Which brings us to the unchosen architects of you. The text pivots away from the internal. and focuses on the external forces building this structure. It lists three: by family, by culture, by experiences you didn't choose.
That's where we get into the massive weight of the environment on the self. It doesn't lean into psychological jargon about nature versus nurture. It just states very plainly what shapes us.
Let's look at family first. This isn't just about inheriting your parents' sense of humor. This is about the norms, the beliefs, and the behaviors of the people you happen to be born around becoming your default baseline for reality.
You're dropped into a family unit with zero agency. Their particular conflict resolution styles, their emotional vocabulary, it all becomes your absolute truth long before you have the cognitive ability to even question it.
And then layered seamlessly over that family unit is the second architect: culture.
Culture is the invisible water we're all swimming in. It dictates the parameters of what we even consider a valid personality. It determines the menu of identities available to you.
So what we might consider a really reserved personality in a highly individualistic, loud society might just be the standard polite baseline somewhere else.
Exactly. If you were born in a different century or on a different continent, your preferences and your reactions would be entirely unrecognizable to you today. Culture hands you the blueprint, and you spend your life thinking you drew it yourself.
But the most striking phrasing in this entire excerpt, the one that really stood out to me, is the third unchosen architect: by experiences you didn't choose.
That specific line completely reframes personal agency.
Because how much of our personality is simply a defense mechanism or an adaptation to unchosen circumstances? Life is fundamentally chaotic. A sudden illness, an economic collapse, or even just a random devastating conversation. These uninvited events crash into us, and they force us to adapt.
And this is where it's worth asking you, the listener, to trace something back. Think about a specific preference or habit you hold really dear. Ask yourself, was it an inherent choice? Or was it an echo of your family, your cultural background, or maybe an unexpected life event?
Often, the attributes we consider our core strengths are merely hardened adaptations. The fiercely independent person who never asks for help might just be carrying the legacy of a time when no one was there to help them.
Or the hyper-observant person who perfectly reads the mood of a room. That might just be a defense mechanism forged in a volatile household where predicting the mood was necessary for survival.
We're walking around wearing our adaptations like a tailored suit.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the climax of the source material. The text brings all of this philosophical deconstruction into one final hanging thought. It says, so the person you believe you are today might be something you learn to become.
The entire weight of the idea rests on that single word: learned.
If our personality is largely a learned behavior, a collection of adaptations rather than an inherent soul, what does that mean for our future?
It fundamentally shatters how we relate to ourselves. A learned behavior is not an absolute truth. It's simply a heuristic we adopted, often unconsciously, because it kept us safe or functional in a specific environment.
I want to talk about the dual nature of that realization. Because for you, the listener, absorbing the idea that you learn to become who you are, it can be incredibly unsettling.
Oh, absolutely. It can induce a profound sense of existential vertigo. If my ambition is a reflection of a cultural obsession with status, and my anxiety is an inheritance from my family, then who is actually driving the car?
It feels destabilizing, like you're just a patchwork quilt of other people's influence.
It's natural to feel that disorientation. We are deeply attached to the narrative of free will and internal consistency. But if we look at the other side of that exact same coin, the realization is profoundly liberating.
Because if you learn to be who you are, it implies the mechanical capacity to learn to be someone else.
Precisely. If you are not a fixed entity, if your current personality is simply the result of a slow education by unchosen architects, it implies a radical capacity for fluidity.
The word learned contains a promise.
It means you are not a finished product destined to play out the exact same behavioral loops forever. You are an ongoing process of adaptation.
It shifts the entire paradigm. If you learn to be closed off because of a specific environment, you possess the capacity to learn to be open. If you learned a baseline of anxiety, you can theoretically introduce new variables to learn a baseline of groundedness.
We aren't saying this is easy. Rewiring decades of habits is incredibly difficult work. But the text is pointing out that the cage door isn't locked. In fact, there might not even be a cage.
And notice how the text refuses to make definitive statements about whether this is good or bad. It doesn't offer a 10-step program for optimizing your new personality.
It simply presents the reality of your constructed nature and then asks you to pause, to look at your deeply ingrained reactions and habits with a lens of gentle, objective curiosity rather than rigid attachment.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we are deliberately going to leave the edges of this conversation frayed. We aren't going to tie this up with a neat bow. We want you to sit with the ambiguity of the learned self.
We've spent this time establishing that the self you are today was largely drafted by architects you didn't choose, by family, culture, and random circumstance. But we want to leave you with one final thing to mull over. What happens when you wake up to the illusion?
What happens when you begin choosing the experiences that will shape the person you become tomorrow?
Exactly. If identity is shaped slowly by what you were exposed to, what environments, what ideas, and what people will you purposefully expose yourself to today? Can you become the conscious, deliberate architect of your next learned self?
You've been listening to The Pause, and we'll be back at 8 a.m. tomorrow.